During a football match, my son splashed beer in my face and hissed, "You've achieved nothing in life." It was shown on the main screen. All the spectators laughed, but several footballers recognized me and shouted, "He's a legend!" My son's jaw dropped in shock. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The vacuum's hum filled my living room like a peaceful meditation. Saturday mornings were mine. No schedules, no demands, just the simple satisfaction of putting things in order. I guided the machine around my worn leather armchair, the one Maria had picked out 15 years ago, back when Gregory still called me Pop instead of avoiding my calls altogether. The sound of an expensive engine cut through the morning air. I glanced toward the window, spotting the sleek silver Tesla pulling into my driveway. My stomach tightened. Gregory never visited on weekends anymore, not unless something was wrong. The front door opened without a knock. It never occurred to him to announce himself in his childhood home. "Dad, why are you still cleaning yourself?" His voice carried that familiar tone of barely concealed irritation. "Couldn't you hire at least a housekeeper?" I switched off the vacuum, the sudden silence making his words hang heavier in the air. My son stood in the doorway, wearing clothes that probably cost more than my monthly utilities: crisp khakis, a navy polo that screamed designer, leather loafers that had never seen real work. I like maintaining order with my own hands. I wound the cord around the vacuum's hooks, buying myself a moment to study his face. Dark circles under his eyes, jaw set tight. "Why are you here so early?" Gregory walked past me and settled into my favorite reading chair without invitation. His gaze swept the room like a real estate appraiser calculating square footage. Everything about his posture suggested he was doing me a favor by being here. "This isn't early, it's normal time for business people." He picked up one of my library books from the side table, examined the cover with obvious disdain, then set it aside. "You live like a retiree." The words stung more than they should have. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of every one of my 65 years. "I am a retiree, son." Gregory's laugh was sharp, humorless. "Right. And that's exactly the problem." I studied his face, searching for the boy who used to help me wash dishes on Saturday mornings, who'd ask about my day and actually listen to the answers. This stranger wearing my son's features looked at my modest home like it was evidence of some personal failing. The morning light streaming through my clean windows suddenly felt harsh instead of welcoming. My house, the place where I'd raised him, where Maria had taught him to tie his shoes and read bedtime stories, seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. "What's wrong with being retired? I worked 40 years, paid for your education, helped you start your business." My voice stayed level, but something cold was spreading through my chest. I earned the right to live quietly. "Quietly?" Gregory stood and began pacing around my coffee table like a restless animal. "Look at this place, Dad. Look at yourself. You've completely given up." I watched him move through my space with that aggressive energy that had started showing up a few years back, right around the time his business took off. Success had changed him, hardened edges that used to be soft. "Given up on what?" "On everything. On ambition, on growth, on mattering." He gestured toward my bookshelf, my modest furniture, the vacuum cleaner still standing in the middle of the room. "When was the last time you did something that actually made a difference?" The question hit like a physical blow. I'd raised him. I'd sacrificed. I'd worked construction jobs and weekend shifts to pay for his college, his graduate degree, his first business loan. But standing there in my own living room, watching my son's face twist with disappointment, I felt those accomplishments crumble into dust. Gregory's designer shoes clicked against my hardwood floor as he paced. Each step felt like an accusation, a rejection of everything I'd built in this house. My hands found the vacuum's handle again, gripping it like an anchor. "You want to know what makes a difference?" I kept my voice steady, but heat was building behind my ribs. "I put you through UCLA. I co-signed your first office lease. I gave you every opportunity to become the man you are today." He stopped mid-stride and turned to face me, his expression shifting from dismissive to something uglier. "Every opportunity? Dad, I had to fight for everything despite your limitations, not because of your help." The words came at me like a slap. I set down the vacuum cleaner deliberately, turned to meet his stare head on. This conversation had crossed into territory we'd never explored before, and something in my chest was telling me to retreat, but I'd spent too many years backing down from fights I should have had. Limitations? My voice climbed higher than I intended. What limitations? The limitation of working 3 jobs to pay your tuition? The limitation of emptying my savings account when your startup needed capital? Gregory's laugh was bitter, sharp enough to cut glass. Those weren't investments, Dad. Those were guilt payments. You knew you weren't giving me anything real. No connections, no network, no example of actual success to follow. He pointed at my bookshelf, my modest television, the framed photographs on the side table. Look around you. Really look. This is the legacy of a man who achieved nothing. This is what settling looks like. My pulse hammered in my temples. The morning light that had felt so peaceful an hour ago now felt like a spotlight exposing every shabby corner of my life. But these were my choices, my contentment, my home that I'd bought with honest money and maintained with my own hands. I achieved plenty. I raised a son who graduated summa cum laude, who built a successful business, who drives a Tesla and wears $1,000 shirts. My voice was getting dangerous now, the kind of tone that used to make Gregory straighten up when he was 12. What more did you want from me? I wanted a father who could show me how to be somebody. The words exploded out of him with a force that made me step backward, not someone who's content to vacuum his way through retirement while the world moves past him. He was moving around my living room now like he owned it, like he was already calculating how much my furniture might bring at an estate sale. The arrogance in his movement, the casual dismissal of everything I'd worked for, sent something dark and hot rising in my throat. You think this house, this life, makes me nobody? I could hear my own voice changing, getting lower, more controlled. You think the man who sacrificed everything for your future is worthless? I think the man who achieved nothing except putting one ungrateful kid through college needs to stop pretending his life mattered. Gregory's voice was ice cold now, surgical in its precision. I made myself Dad, despite having a father who never showed me what real success looks like. The silence that followed felt like a vacuum, sucking all the air from the room. I stared at my son, my only child, the boy I'd held in the hospital 38 years ago, the young man whose first business plan I'd helped him type on my old computer, and saw absolutely no recognition of who I was or what I'd given him. Get out! The words came from somewhere deep in my chest, somewhere I hadn't accessed in decades. Get out of my house. Now! Gregory's face shifted, surprise flickering across his features for just a moment before the arrogance reasserted itself. Fine. I should have known better than to waste my time here anyway. But neither of us moved. We stood frozen in my living room, both shocked by how far we'd fallen, how quickly decades of relationship had shattered into pieces neither of us knew how to pick up. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. Gregory's surprise had already hardened back into that familiar mask of superiority, but I could see something else flickering underneath, maybe regret, maybe just wounded pride. I said, "Get out." I walked to the front door, pulled it open wide. The morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of jasmine from my neighbor's yard. Until you learn to respect your father, you won't be welcome in this house. Gregory grabbed his expensive jacket from the back of my chair, his movements sharp and deliberate. Fine. I don't need this pathetic place anyway. He paused at the threshold, looking back at me with something that might have been disappointment. I thought maybe we could have an adult conversation, but I forgot. You've never learned how to be anything except ordinary. The front door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the picture frames on my hallway table. I watched through the window as he stalked to his Tesla, every line of his body radiating anger. The car's engine purred to life, even his exit had to sound expensive, and he backed out of my driveway with unnecessary speed. I stood at the window until the silver car disappeared around the corner, until the street returned to its Saturday morning quiet. Then I closed the door and turned back to my empty living room. The vacuum cleaner stood exactly where I'd left it, cord wrapped neatly around its hooks. My coffee mug sat on the side table next to the library book Gregory had dismissed. Everything was exactly the same, but the air itself felt different now, thinner, charged with the electricity of words that couldn't be taken back. I sank into my reading chair, the leather creaking under my weight. The cushions still held the slight depression where Gregory had sat, where he'd looked around my home and found it wanting. My home, the place where Maria and I had planned our future, where we'd brought our baby son home from the hospital, where I'd taught that same boy to ride a bicycle in the backyard. The photographs on the side table caught my eye. Images of birthday parties and graduations, family vacations to the beach, Gregory in his cap and gown the day he got his MBA. In every picture, he was smiling. When had that changed? When had his smile become a calculation instead of joy? Maria, what am I doing wrong with our son? I spoke to the empty room, to the woman who'd been gone 3 years now, but whose presence still lingered in every corner of this house. She'd been the bridge between Gregory and me, the translator who could make us understand each other. Without her, we'd become strangers speaking different languages. I picked up the photo from his college graduation, studied his young face. 22 years old, full of ambition and gratitude. He'd hugged me that day, told me he couldn't have done it without his old man. When had that gratitude curdled into resentment? When had my love become insufficient? My hands were shaking slightly, leftover adrenaline from the confrontation. I'd thrown my only child out of my house, the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd supported through every challenge, the son who carried my name and my hopes for the future. And he'd stood in my living room and called me ordinary, worthless, nobody. Maybe he was right. Maybe this house, this quiet life, this contentment I'd found in simple routines, maybe it all added up to nothing in the world's accounting. But it was mine. I'd earned it with honest work, built it with love, maintained it with pride. If that made me ordinary, then ordinary was enough. The morning sun was higher now, slanting through my windows at a different angle. The day was moving forward whether I was ready or not. I needed to talk to someone, needed a perspective that wasn't colored by hurt and anger. Frank would understand. Frank had known me before Gregory was born, had seen me through Maria's death, had always been able to cut through my confusion with simple truth. I reached for my phone, then stopped. Not yet. First, I needed to sit with this, to understand what had really happened here. My son had tried to shame me for being content, for finding peace in retirement, for choosing simplicity over endless ambition. But the man who delivered those cutting words wasn't the son I'd raised. That man had been angry about something else, something deeper than my housekeeping habits or modest lifestyle. Tomorrow, I'd call Frank. Tomorrow, I'd figure out what came next. But today, I'd sit in my chair in my house and remember who I was before my son tried to convince me I was nobody. 4 hours of replaying Gregory's words had left my head spinning in circles. The afternoon sun slanted differently through my windows now, casting shadows that made everything feel changed. I needed Frank's perspective, needed someone who'd known me long enough to remember who I was before today's demolition. The original Pantry Cafe sat on Figueroa Street like it had for the past century, unchanged and unapologetic about it. Frank and I had been meeting here monthly for 15 years, ever since Maria died, and I'd needed someone to help me navigate the strange territories of widowhood. The familiar red neon sign felt like a welcome mat after this morning's chaos. Frank was already waiting at our usual window table, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that looked tiny against his linebacker frame. Even at 67, he still carried himself like he could take on a blocking sled. His dark eyes found mine the moment I walked through the door, and I watched his expression shift from casual greeting to immediate concern. "Buddy, you look like you've been hit by a truck." He stood up as I approached, that old habit from our playing days when respect mattered more than convenience. "What happened?" I slumped into the booth across from him, suddenly feeling every one of my 65 years. The coffee and bacon smell of the cafe usually comforted me, but today it just reminded me how empty my own house had felt after Gregory left. "Gregory came by this morning." The words came out heavier than I'd intended. We had words, bad ones. Frank's eyebrows rose, but he didn't interrupt. That was his gift, knowing when to listen and when to speak. He signaled the waitress for another coffee while I gathered the courage to explain how my own son had gutted me in my own living room. Buddy, he called me a failure. Me, the words burst out with more pain than anger, said I achieved nothing, that I was nobody who didn't matter. 38 years old, and he stands in my house telling me my whole life was worthless. Frank leaned forward, his expression darkening. What brought this on? Gregory's always been proud, but not cruel. I told him everything, the vacuum cleaner, the dismissive comments about my retirement, the escalating insults about my modest lifestyle. Frank's face grew more serious with each detail, his jaw tightening when I repeated Gregory's final assault about achieving nothing. I threw him out, I finished, my voice barely above a whisper. Told him he wasn't welcome until he learned respect. Was I wrong, Frank? Should a father accept that kind of treatment from his child? The silence stretched between us while Frank processed my story. Outside the window, Los Angeles traffic moved in its eternal dance, people going about their Saturday afternoon without knowing that my world had shifted on its axis. Kids sometimes say foolish things when they're angry, Frank said finally, his tone measured and careful. But what you're describing... He shook his head. That wasn't anger talking, Waldo. That was someone trying to tear you down on purpose. Relief flooded through me like cool water. Frank understood. Frank saw what I'd seen, that this wasn't just a family argument gone wrong. I did so much for him, buddy. College, graduate school, helped him start his business. I emptied my savings to give him every opportunity, and he stands there telling me I gave him nothing. That's exactly why he should come to you first. Frank's voice carried the authority of a man who'd raised 3 children of his own. You don't give in to bullies, even when they're your blood, especially when they're your blood. He told me about his own son, Carlos, who'd gone through a phase at 30 where he'd criticized every choice Frank had made as a father. I told him the same thing you told Gregory. Respect comes first, or the conversation doesn't happen. Took 8 months, but he came around. Apologized like a man, and meant it. 8 months? The number felt like a sentence. Some lessons take time to sink in. But here's what I learned. The longer you wait for genuine respect, the more valuable it becomes when it finally arrives. Don't give in because it hurts to wait. Frank reached across the table and squeezed my shoulder, his hand heavy with decades of friendship. You raised a good boy underneath all that pride, Waldo. But right now, he's forgotten who taught him how to be a man. Let him remember on his own terms. I sat back in the booth, feeling some of the day's weight lifting from my shoulders. Frank's words made sense in a way my own thoughts hadn't. Gregory needed to find his way back to respect, not be enabled in his disrespect. So I wait? You wait. And you remember that being a good father sometimes means accepting temporary pain for long-term healing. Frank smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. Besides, you've got plenty to be proud of, even if your son's too blind to see it right now. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes with decades of friendship. When I stood to leave, Frank gripped my hand firmly. Call me if you need to talk. But trust me on this. Stand your ground. He'll come around. Walking to my car, I felt steadier than I had all day. Frank's advice rang true in my chest, solid and unshakable. Gregory would have to come to me with genuine respect, or we'd have no relationship at all. The pain of waiting would be worth it if it meant getting my son back as a man who valued what his father had given him. The drive home felt different, not empty but expectant, like I was heading towards something instead of away from it. The first morning without Gregory felt like learning to breathe underwater. I stood in my kitchen with coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at my phone on the counter like it might ring if I concentrated hard enough. It didn't. Frank's words echoed in my head. Wait for genuine respect. Easy advice to accept in the warm comfort of the pantry cafe, harder to follow in the silence of my empty house. Tuesday passed like watching paint dry. Wednesday felt longer. By Thursday, I'd picked up the phone 6 times, Gregory's number half-dialed before I'd forced myself to set it down. Each time I'd hear Frank's voice. Don't give in to bullies, even when they're your blood. The garden became my salvation. Spring in Los Angeles meant constant growth, constant need for attention. I planted new marigolds along the back fence, their bright orange faces like tiny suns in the dark soil. Physical work helped quiet the voice in my head, that kept asking whether stubborn pride was worth losing my only child. A week passed, then another day. My routine developed its own rhythm. Morning coffee with the phone nearby, afternoon gardening until my hands were black with earth, evening reading in my chair with Maria's picture watching from the side table. Maybe I should call him after all. I spoke to her photograph one evening, the house settling into its nighttime quiet around us. The young woman in the frame smiled back with secrets I'd never learn, but then I'd remember Gregory's face, the cold calculation in his voice when he'd called me worthless. No, I'd tell the silence. He needs to learn respect. On day 10, I found myself in our bedroom, pulling out the wooden box where I kept Maria's letters. Her handwriting still made my chest tight, those careful loops and crosses that had filled grocery lists and love notes for 35 years. One letter, written when Gregory was 12 and testing every boundary we'd set, stopped me cold. My darling Waldo, I know you worry about being too strict with our boy, but remember, we're not raising a child. We're raising a future man. If we don't teach him respect and gratitude now, the world will teach him much harder lessons later. Trust your instincts. You're a better father than you know. I read those words 3 times, Maria's voice clear in my memory. She'd understood something I'd forgotten. Love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was enabling. The second week moved with glacial slowness. Every morning brought the same temptation to call, to apologize, to accept whatever scraps of affection Gregory might offer. But Maria's letter had steadied something in my resolve. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about teaching a 38-year-old man what his 12-year-old self had somehow forgotten. Neighbors stopped by occasionally. Mrs. Chen from next door brought vegetables from her garden. Tom from across the street helped me fix a loose board on my front steps. Normal life continuing while my family fell apart in slow motion. "Your son doing well?" Mrs. Chen asked on day 13, her English careful but kind. "He's finding his way," I answered, which felt more honest than admitting I had no idea where he was or what he was thinking. That night, I sat in my reading chair with the phone in my lap, Gregory's contact information glowing on the screen. One touch, and I could hear his voice. Maybe he'd been waiting for me to call. Maybe he'd realized his mistake, but was too proud to make the first move. My finger hovered over the call button. Then I set the phone aside and picked up Maria's letter again. "Trust your instincts," she'd written. My instincts said that any relationship built on me surrendering my dignity wasn't worth having. 2 weeks. 14 days of wondering whether my son missed me, whether he'd learned anything from our confrontation, whether I'd destroyed the most important relationship in my life for the sake of abstract principles. But as I turned off the lights and headed to bed that Sunday night, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not happiness. The house was still too quiet. Gregory's absence still ached like a missing tooth. But peace that I'd made the right choice, that some things were worth waiting for even when the waiting felt like dying slowly. Tomorrow would be day 15, and the day after that, day 16. However long it took for my son to remember that his father deserved respect, I'd be here, waiting, ready to welcome him home the moment he was ready to return as a man instead of a spoiled child. The phone stayed silent on my nightstand, and for the first time in 2 weeks, that silence felt like victory instead of loss. Monday evening settled over Echo Park like a familiar blanket. I'd finished a simple dinner of pasta and vegetables, washed the dishes, and settled into my reading chair with the evening paper when the doorbell cut through the quiet. My heart jumped. Nobody visited on Monday nights. Through the peephole, I saw Gregory standing on my front step. But this wasn't the arrogant man who'd stormed out 2 weeks ago. His posture was different. Shoulders less rigid, hands visible instead of buried in expensive pockets. He looked humble. I opened the door slowly, cautiously. "Dad." The single word carried weight I hadn't heard in his voice for years. "Can we talk?" His eyes met mine directly, no games or deflection. I stepped aside, gesturing him into the house where our family had exploded 15 days ago. He walked into the living room and stood beside the same chair where he'd sat in judgment. But this time he waited for permission. "Sit, please." I settled into my own chair, studying his face for signs of the man who'd called me a failure. "What do you want to say?" Gregory's hands clasped together in his lap, and when he spoke, his voice carried something I'd almost given up hope of hearing. Genuine remorse. "Dad, forgive me. I said terrible things. Cruel things that aren't true and that I had no right to say." He paused, swallowing hard. "You're not a failure. You never were. I was angry about other things, and I took it out on you in the worst possible way." The words hit me like warm rain after a drought. 2 weeks of waiting, of wondering if I'd lost my son forever, and here he was acknowledging what we both knew. He'd crossed lines that should never be crossed. "Son, I hoped so much you would come back." My voice cracked slightly on the words. "Those things you said, they cut deep, deeper than you know." "I know." Gregory leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way I hadn't seen since he was young. "I called you ordinary, worthless, said you achieved nothing. But, Dad, you achieved the most important thing. You raised me. Even when I act like an ungrateful fool, you raised me to know better." Relief flooded through me so powerfully I had to grip the arms of my chair. This was my son talking, the boy I'd raised, not the stranger who'd visited 2 weeks ago. "I want to make amends," Gregory continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I know it doesn't erase what I said, but—" He produced 2 tickets, holding them toward me. "Los Angeles Rams, this Sunday. I thought maybe we could go together." I took the tickets with hands that trembled slightly. NFL games weren't cheap, and these looked like good seats. The gesture spoke louder than words. My son was investing real money in our relationship, not just offering empty apologies. "Football?" I looked up at him, warmth spreading through my chest. "We haven't been to sports together in so long." "Too long?" Gregory's smile seemed genuine, reaching his eyes for the first time in months. "I remember you teaching me about quarterbacks when I was little. Thought maybe you could teach me more about the game, if you want to." The irony made me want to laugh, but I held it back. If only he knew what I could teach him about quarterbacks. But that was a conversation for another day. Today was about rebuilding bridges, not revealing secrets. "With pleasure. I'd love to go to a game with my son." I stood up, and Gregory rose too. For a moment we looked at each other across the space where harsh words had shattered our relationship 2 weeks ago. Then Gregory stepped forward and hugged me. Really hugged me, like he used to when he was young and I was his hero instead of his disappointment. His arms felt strong around my shoulders, and I hugged him back with 15 days' worth of missed connection. "Thank you for waiting for me to come to my senses," he murmured against my shoulder. "Thank you for not giving up." "I would never give up on you," I whispered back, meaning every word. "You're my son, my only son." When we separated, Gregory's eyes were bright with emotion that looked real, felt real. The arrogant businessman who'd dismissed my life was nowhere to be seen. This was my boy, my child, asking for forgiveness and offering to rebuild what we'd both broken. "Sunday, then?" He tapped the tickets in my hand. "I'll pick you up at 11. The game starts at 1. "I'll be ready." I walked him to the door, neither of us wanting to break the spell of reconciliation. "Drive safely." "I will." "And Dad?" Gregory paused at the threshold, looking back at me with something that might have been wonder. "I'm proud to be your son. I should have remembered that sooner." The Tesla pulled away much more quietly than it had 2 weeks ago, like even the car understood this was a different kind of departure. I stood in my doorway watching the taillights disappear, clutching the football tickets like proof that miracles still happened. Inside I called Frank. "Buddy, you were right," I said when he answered. "Gregory came back. He apologized like a man, and he meant it." Frank's laughter rumbled through the phone. "Told you he'd come around. Good boys remember their raising eventually." Sunday couldn't come fast enough. The house felt different after Gregory left, lighter somehow, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally lifted from my shoulders. I picked up the football tickets from my coffee table, running my thumb across the glossy surface. Los Angeles Rams. Section 133. Sunday, 1 p.m. My son wanted to spend time with me. I had to tell Frank. He'd guided me through the darkest 2 weeks of doubt, and now he deserved to know that his wisdom had paid off. I grabbed my phone and dialed his familiar number, pacing around my living room while it rang. Waldo, Frank's voice carried surprise. How are you holding up, friend? Buddy, you were right. Gregory came with apologies. The words tumbled out faster than I could organize them. Real apologies, Frank. The kind where he looked me in the eye and meant every word. A pause on the other end, then Frank's warm chuckle. That's wonderful, friend. How did he seem? I told him everything, how Gregory had stood at my door with his shoulders lowered instead of raised in arrogance, how his voice had carried genuine remorse when he'd called himself a fool. Frank listened without interrupting, asking careful questions about my son's demeanor and the specific words he'd used. Genuinely remorseful, I emphasized, stopping by my window where Gregory's Tesla had been parked just hours ago. He even brought game tickets. Rams tickets, Frank. Good seats, too. Said he wanted to make amends. Game tickets? Frank's tone shifted slightly, becoming more interested. That's a generous gesture. That's what I thought. We haven't been to sports together since he was in college. Back then, he used to ask me questions about strategy, about how quarterbacks read defenses. I trailed off, realizing I was revealing more than I should. Even with Frank, some habits died hard. I'm happy for you, truly. Frank's voice carried genuine warmth, but underneath I detected something else. Caution, maybe. Just remember what we talked about. Let him understand the boundaries you've set. Don't be too quick to forget what happened. Oh, he understands, I assured him, settling back into my reading chair. You should have heard him, buddy. He admitted everything, called himself ungrateful, said I'd achieved the most important thing by raising him right. Even when he acted like a fool, he said, I'd raised him to know better. Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his words were measured. That sounds promising. And you? How do you feel about all this? Relieved? The word came out heavier than I'd expected. More than relieved. Grateful. For 2 weeks I wondered if I'd lost my son forever over pride and principles. But you were right. He came back as a man, not a spoiled child. Good, Frank said simply. That's how it should be. When's this game? Sunday afternoon. I'm picking up a jersey tomorrow. Haven't worn Rams colors in years. Gregory seemed excited about teaching me more about the current team. I laughed, thinking about the irony. If only my son knew what I could teach him about professional football. Enjoy it, Frank advised. But remember, one gesture doesn't erase everything. Let him prove that this change is real through his actions, not just his words. Frank's caution felt unnecessary now, but I appreciated his concern. He'd seen me through Maria's death, through lonely years of widowhood, through 2 weeks of wondering if my only child respected me at all. His protective instincts came from love. I will. But Frank, I have to tell you, sitting there listening to him apologize, seeing him offer this gesture, it felt like getting my son back, the real Gregory, the one Maria and I raised, not the stranger who'd been visiting these past few years. That's what every father hopes for, Frank replied. I'm glad you waited. I'm glad you stood your ground. After we hung up, I sat in my chair holding the tickets, imagining Sunday afternoon. Father and son sharing popcorn and commentary, cheering for the same team. Gregory asking questions about the game while I pretended I was just a knowledgeable fan, instead of someone who'd once thrown touchdown passes in stadiums just like Sophie. The evening news played in the background, but I wasn't listening. Instead, I was planning what to wear, wondering if Gregory would want to grab dinner after the game, thinking about how to rebuild the easy relationship we'd once shared. Frank's words echoed in my mind. Let him prove this change is real. But looking at those expensive tickets, remembering the humility in Gregory's voice, I felt certain the proof was already there. My son had returned to me, and Sunday would be our new beginning. I marked the date on my calendar with a red pen, counting the days. 6 more sleeps until I got my boy back completely. Sunday morning arrived crisp and bright, perfect California weather for football. I'd been awake since 6, too excited to sleep, checking the clock every 20 minutes like a kid waiting for Christmas. When Gregory's Tesla pulled into my driveway at exactly 11, I was ready. Clean jeans, my old Rams t-shirt I'd found in the back of my closet, and a genuine smile that felt foreign after weeks of family tension. "Looking good, Dad," Gregory called out as I locked my front door. He was dressed casually but expensively. Designer jeans and a polo that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. But his smile seemed genuine, his energy matching mine. Ready for some football? The drive to Inglewood took 45 minutes through typical Los Angeles traffic, but the conversation flowed easier than it had in years. Gregory talked about his business, carefully avoiding the stress and problems I didn't know existed. I shared neighborhood gossip and updates on our old neighbors, both of us working to rebuild the comfortable father-son dynamic we'd lost somewhere along the way. SoFi Stadium rose from the landscape like something from the future, all curves and gleaming surfaces that caught the afternoon sun. I'd seen it on television, but standing beneath its massive structure felt different. This wasn't the cramped concrete stadiums of my playing days. This was architecture as art, technology as spectacle. Impressive, right? Gregory watched my face as we walked through the entrance. Cost $5 billion to build. Everything's digital now. Even the seats have charging ports. Security moved us through quickly with our VIP passes, and I found myself in a world I'd forgotten existed. Concourses wider than some streets, concession stands offering sushi alongside traditional hot dogs, massive screens displaying pre-game content everywhere I looked. The boy who'd once begged for peanuts at Angels games was now buying us craft beer, and gourmet pretzels like money meant nothing. Our seats lived up to Gregory's promise. Section 133, row 12, with a perfect view of the entire field. Close enough to see individual players' faces, high enough to understand the chess match developing on the turf below. I settled into the comfortable chair, accepting the cold beer Gregory handed me, and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for weeks. Thank you, son. I meant it completely. I haven't been to such a game in so long. It's the least I could do after those words. Gregory's response carried just the right note of regret, mixed with determination. Besides, remember how you used to throw with me in the backyard? You taught me to spiral the ball properly. The memory hit like a warm wave. 8-year-old Gregory, tongue poking out in concentration, trying to wrap his small fingers around a junior-sized football while I adjusted his grip. Put your index finger on the laces, son. Feel how the ball wants to spin. Hours of patient instruction, both of us getting grass stains on our knees. The game always brought us together, I said, watching the Rams take the field for warm-ups. The familiar sound of whistles and crowd chatter filled the air around us. Yes, I remember how you taught me to throw the ball. Gregory's voice carried genuine nostalgia. You had this way of explaining things that made sense, about reading the defense, about timing the throw. I nodded, careful not to reveal too much. Gregory thought his father was just an informed fan, not someone who'd once read those same defenses from behind center, who'd thrown those same timing routes under pressure from 300-pound defensive linemen. The stadium filled around us, families wearing jerseys, groups of friends sharing nachos, couples holding hands while debating draft picks. Normal people living normal lives, enjoying normal father-son time without the weight of hidden agendas or financial desperation. At least that's what I assumed. Look at that crowd, I marveled, gesturing toward the opposite end zone where a solid wall of blue and gold stretched toward the sky. 70,000 people, all here for the same reason. Gregory nodded, but I noticed his attention wasn't entirely on the spectacle. His eyes kept drifting to his phone, checking the time, glancing around our section like he was mapping escape routes. Game day excitement, I figured. Some people got nervous in big crowds. The national anthem began, and we stood with 69,000 other fans, hands over hearts, voices joining in rough harmony. Gregory sang along, but his fingers drummed against his beer cup, a nervous habit I remembered from his childhood. Big test at school, piano recital, first job interview, always the same unconscious rhythm. You okay? I asked as we settled back into our seats. Perfect, he replied quickly. Just excited. It's been too long since we did something like this together. The teams lined up for kickoff, and the crowd's energy shifted into high gear. Whistles shrieked, bodies collided. The familiar ballet of professional football began unfolding below us. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely relaxed, completely happy. My son beside me, good seats, perfect weather, and 3 hours of shared entertainment ahead. Gregory leaned closer, his voice competing with the crowd noise. Dad, Can we talk about something during the first quarter? Something important? Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. The nervous energy I had attributed to game excitement seemed more focused now, more purposeful. But before I could ask what he meant, the Rams' offense took the field, and the crowd exploded around us. Whatever Gregory wanted to discuss would have to wait. Right now, I was exactly where I wanted to be. The Rams moved the ball efficiently on their opening drive, 3 quick completions that had the crowd on its feet. But Gregory wasn't watching the action. His beer cup twisted between his hands like a stress toy, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the stadium noise with an urgency that made my stomach tighten. "Dad, I need your help. Financial help." The words hit me like cold water. One moment I was enjoying the perfect spiral of a 20-yard completion. The next, I was staring at my son's tense face, trying to understand how our reconciliation had suddenly shifted into something else entirely. "How much do you need?" The question came automatically, though part of me already suspected I wouldn't like the answer. Gregory leaned closer, his voice dropping despite the crowd noise. 50,000. My business failed. The number sat between us like an unexploded bomb. $50,000. I made less than that in a year on my pension. The beer in my hand suddenly tasted bitter, the stadium lights too bright. "Failed?" I managed. "When? How long has this been going on?" 6 months, maybe longer. Gregory's words came faster now, like he'd been holding them back too long. The real estate market shifted. Commercial properties aren't moving, and I'm leveraged too heavily. Without an immediate injection of capital, I'll lose everything. My mind reeled, trying to process this information alongside everything I thought I knew about my son's life. The Tesla in my driveway, the expensive clothes, the confidence he'd always projected, all of it suddenly looked different, like a stage set hiding the reality behind it. "Son, I don't have that kind of money." The admission felt like confessing to a fundamental failure as a father. "My pension covers my expenses, but 50,000?" I shook my head. "That's more than I have in savings." Gregory's face shifted through several emotions. Surprise, disbelief, then something that looked dangerously close to anger. "That can't be. You used to earn good money. All those years working construction, the overtime, the weekend jobs. You must have saved something." The irony was almost funny. If only he knew about the NFL pension, the money I'd earned throwing touchdown passes instead of pouring concrete. But that secret belonged to a different life, one I'd deliberately hidden from him to teach him independence and humility. "I saved what I could," I said carefully. "But raising you, putting you through college, helping you start your business, that took most of it. I don't have $50,000 lying around. But I need it." Gregory's voice cracked slightly, desperation creeping through his controlled facade. "Dad, I wouldn't ask if there was any other option. I've exhausted everything else. Family is supposed to help family." The words stung because they were true, but also because of what they revealed about his assumption that I'd been holding back, keeping resources from him out of selfishness rather than necessity. Around us, the crowd cheered as the Rams scored their first touchdown, but the celebration felt distant, irrelevant to the drama unfolding in our expensive seats. "Gregory, listen to me." I set down my beer, turning to face him fully. "If I had it, I would give it to you. But I'm a 65-year-old retiree living on a fixed income. I don't have that kind of money." "Fixed income?" His voice carried bitter laughter. "Dad, you worked for 40 years. You can't tell me you don't have any assets, any investments, anything I could borrow against." The conversation was spiraling into territory I hadn't expected, revealing assumptions and misunderstandings that went back years. Gregory had always believed his father was holding back, keeping wealth secret, living modestly out of choice rather than necessity. The truth, that I was exactly what I appeared to be, seemed impossible for him to accept. "My house is my biggest asset," I explained patiently. "Everything else went to giving you the best start in life I could manage. College tuition, graduate school, your first business loan. Remember? I co-signed that note when no bank would touch you. And now I need more." Gregory's voice hardened. "I need you to help me again, or everything you invested in my future will be wasted." The manipulation in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't a son asking his father for help. This was a businessman making his final pitch, using emotional leverage to close a deal. The reconciliation, the humble apology, the expensive football tickets, suddenly it all looked different. Not the generous gesture of a remorseful son, but the calculated investment of a desperate man. When did you plan this? The question escaped before I could stop it. The apology, the tickets, this conversation. How long have you been setting this up? Gregory's face flushed, caught between denial and admission. It's not like that, Dad. I genuinely wanted to apologize, to make things right between us. But yes, I also need help. Is that wrong? Is it wrong to hope your father might care enough about your future to... To what? I interrupted, my voice louder than intended. A few nearby fans glanced our way, then politely looked back at the field. To lie about my financial situation? To pretend I have money I don't have? To prioritize your son over your pride? Gregory's words came out sharp, cutting. To remember that family means more than keeping score. The accusation hung between us while the second quarter began below. My son, the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd sacrificed for, was sitting in a stadium seat I now realized cost more than my monthly grocery budget, calling me selfish for not having money I'd never possessed. I stared at the field, watching millionaire athletes play a game I'd once dominated, feeling the weight of secrets I couldn't share and resources I didn't have. The perfect father-son afternoon I'd imagined was dissolving into something much uglier, much more complicated. Gregory shifted beside me, his beer cup creaking under the pressure of his grip. Whatever came next, I could feel it building, like pressure in a storm system, ready to explode. Gregory's frustration had been building, like pressure in a boiler, for 45 minutes. Each time I gently but firmly refused his financial demands, his jaw had tightened a little more. His grip on the beer cup had grown more desperate. Now, watching families around us enjoy normal father-son conversations, while his world crumbled, something inside him finally snapped. I can't stand this anymore. He shot to his feet, the sudden movement making nearby fans glance our way. The beer cup in his hands trembled with barely controlled rage. You sit there acting like some wise old man when you're just a selfish, pathetic failure. Before I could respond, before I could even register what was happening, Gregory raised the plastic cup and hurled its contents directly into my face. The cold beer hit me like a slap, soaking through my shirt, dripping from my hair down onto the expensive VIP seats that had cost him money he didn't have. You've achieved nothing in your life. His voice carried across our section with enough force to stop conversations 3 rows away. Nothing. You're a worthless old man who can't help his own son. I sat frozen, beer dripping from my chin, staring up at the stranger wearing my son's face. Around us, people turned to watch the spectacle unfold. A few pulled out phones to record what was clearly becoming the most dramatic halftime entertainment they'd ever witnessed. The massive jumbotron caught the moment. Security cameras automatically scanning for crowd reactions had found our section just as Gregory's rage exploded. Suddenly, my humiliation wasn't limited to a few dozen nearby seats. 70,000 people watched a 65-year-old man get publicly drenched and berated by his own child. Look at yourself, Gregory continued, gesturing wildly while the crowd's murmur grew louder, living in that tiny house, driving that old car, counting pennies like some charity case, and you have the nerve to tell me you can't help your own son? The laughter started in the sections closest to us, spreading like ripples across the stadium as people realized they were witnessing a family meltdown of epic proportions. Fingers pointed, phones recorded. Strangers who knew nothing about our lives joined in the mockery of my pain. Gregory, how could you? The words came out barely above a whisper, but the stadium's acoustics carried them through the microphones near the field. How could I what? Tell the truth? He was fully committed now, feeding off the crowd's attention like an actor who'd found his spotlight. Tell everyone what I've had to live with my whole life? A father who achieved nothing, earned nothing, contributed nothing to this world except disappointment. The beer was soaking through my shirt to my skin, cold and sticky and shameful. I reached for a napkin with hands that shook, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of having my most private family, pain turned into public entertainment. I can't stand your patheticness anymore. Gregory's voice cracked with emotion, but not the kind that comes from love. This was pure frustration, the rage of a drowning man who'd expected his father to be his life preserver and discovered only an anchor. A group of college-age fans in the section below us started a slow clap, treating our family crisis like performance art. Someone shouted, "Tell him, kid!" Another voice called out, "Daddy issues on the big screen!" The security guards were beginning to move in our direction, but the incident was unfolding too quickly for intervention. Besides, what crime was being committed? A son verbally abusing his father? Public humiliation? Emotional devastation broadcast to thousands? I tried to wipe the beer from my face, but my hands kept shaking. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was the complete destruction of everything I'd tried to build with my son, played out in front of strangers who saw it as entertainment rather than the death of a relationship. "You want to know why I need money?" Gregory's voice had taken on a desperate edge now, like he was past the point of no return. "Because I refuse to end up like you, sitting alone in a house that time forgot, living off scraps, pretending that mediocrity is some kind of virtue." The crowd's energy was feeding him now, their laughter and jeers giving him the audience he'd never had for his resentment. Years of buried frustration poured out in a torrent of public cruelty that no father should ever endure. I sat there, soaked in beer and shame, watching my son perform my humiliation for thousands of strangers. The Jumbotron showed my face, confused, hurt, wet with beer and perhaps something more, to an entire stadium that had come to watch football and found family destruction instead. "Look at him!" Gregory pointed at me like I was evidence in a trial. "This is what happens when you settle for nothing, when you aim low and achieve even less. This is what failure looks like, people." The applause that followed felt like bullets. 70,000 people laughing at the pain of a father who'd spent 40 years sacrificing for the son who was now destroying him in public. The beer dripped steadily from my hair onto my hands, each drop a reminder of how far we'd fallen. But as Gregory continued his public assassination of my character, as the crowd's laughter reached a crescendo, as the cameras captured every moment of my humiliation for posterity, something was about to happen that would change everything. Near the sideline, a group of Los Angeles Rams players had stopped their halftime routine to watch the Jumbotron, and one of them, a young quarterback named Jamal Hayes, was studying my face with growing recognition. The laughter was still echoing across SoFi Stadium when Jamal Hayes grabbed his teammate's arm on the sideline. "Terrell, look at that guy on the screen, the one getting soaked by his kid." Tyrell Brooks, the Rams' starting linebacker, followed his quarterback's gaze to the Jumbotron, where my humiliation continued to play out in high definition. My beer-soaked face filled the screen as Gregory gestured wildly, still berating me for the entertainment of thousands. "Wait a minute." Terrell's voice carried the slow realization of recognition. "Is that—" "No way. Jamal, that's Waldo Cruz." "Waldo Cruz?" Hayes stared harder at the screen, then his eyes went wide. "Holy, that's the Waldo Cruz, the quarterback?" Word spread quickly among the players gathering near the sideline. Within seconds, half the Rams roster was staring at the Jumbotron, trying to confirm what their teammates were seeing. The crowd was still laughing at my public humiliation, but down on the field, a different kind of excitement was building. "That's him," confirmed Marcus Washington, the veteran center who'd grown up studying game footage from the 80s. "Three-time Super Bowl champion, Hall of Fame, one of the greatest quarterbacks who ever played the game." Hayes didn't hesitate. He grabbed a wireless microphone from the sideline crew and jogged toward the section where I sat, still dripping with my son's contempt. The other players followed, creating a procession that confused the crowd, but drew the camera's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes' voice boomed through the stadium's sound system, instantly silencing the laughter. "Could I have your attention, please?" The massive stadium fell quiet, with shocking suddenness. 70,000 people who'd been enjoying the spectacle of family dysfunction suddenly found themselves listening to their team's quarterback making an unscheduled announcement. "The man you've been watching on the screen, the one being disrespected by his son, that gentleman is Waldo Cruz." Hayes paused, letting the name sink in. "NFL legend, three-time Super Bowl champion, Hall of Fame quarterback, one of the greatest players in the history of American football." The silence that followed was profound. You could hear individual conversations stopping, the rustle of programs, the distant hum of stadium equipment. Gregory's mouth fell open as he stared first at the players, then at me, then back at the players as if they'd made some impossible mistake. This man, Terrell Brooks, took the microphone, his voice carrying across the stadium with reverence, completed 63% of his passes over a 12-year career. He threw for over 30,000 yards and 200 touchdown passes. He led 3 different teams to Super Bowl victories. I felt something shifting in my chest, not pride exactly, but a recognition that my hidden past was no longer hidden. The crowd's energy was transforming from mockery to amazement, their laughter replaced by murmurs of recognition and respect. Waldo Cruz retired in 1994 due to a knee injury, Hayes continued, reading details from his phone where a teammate had quickly pulled up my statistics. He walked away from football at the height of his career rather than risk permanent disability. He chose family over fame. The irony was overwhelming. My son had just finished calling me a failure in front of 70,000 people, and now those same people were learning that I'd walked away from greatness to be the father he'd never respected. "Mr. Cruz," Hayes called directly to me through the microphone, "would you please stand up? This stadium should know who you really are." Gregory sank back into his seat like he'd been physically struck. His face had gone pale, his earlier rage replaced by something approaching horror. He was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, trying to reconcile the legend the players were describing with the ordinary retirees he'd spent his life dismissing. The crowd was on its feet now, not laughing but applauding. The same jumbotron that had broadcast my humiliation now showed my face again, but this time the context was completely different. Instead of a pathetic old man being abused by his son, they were seeing a football legend who'd been hidden in plain sight. "3 Super Bowl rings!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Holy cow, that's actually Waldo Cruz!" "I watched him play," called another voice. My dad took me to see him at the Coliseum in '89. The transformation was complete. What had been entertainment at my expense became reverence for achievement they'd never known existed. The beer still dripped from my shirt. Gregory still sat in shock beside me. But everything else had changed in the span of 3 minutes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes said into the microphone, his voice carrying genuine excitement, "we are honored to have a true legend of the game in our stadium today. Mr. Cruz, this crowd would love to hear from you." I stood slowly, my legs unsteady, not from age, but from the emotional whiplash of the last hour. 70,000 people who'd been laughing at my humiliation were now giving me a standing ovation. My son, who'd called me worthless, was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and shame. The microphone was being passed up through the crowd toward me. In a few moments I'd have the chance to address the stadium that had witnessed both my lowest point and my vindication. Gregory sat frozen beside me, finally beginning to understand who his father really was. The crowd waited. The players waited. My son waited. And for the first time in decades, Waldo Cruz, the football legend, was about to speak. The microphone felt familiar in my hands, like holding a football after years away from the game. 70,000 faces looked up at me with expectation, their earlier laughter replaced by respectful attention. Gregory sat beside me in stunned silence, his world completely rearranged in the space of 5 minutes. "Thank you," I said simply, my voice carrying across the stadium with surprising steadiness. "Yes, I'm Waldo Cruz. I played quarterback in the NFL from 1982 to 1994. 3 Super Bowl victories. Hall of Fame class of 1999. The crowd erupted in appreciation, but I raised my hand for quiet. This moment was about more than career statistics. I retired because of a knee injury that threatened permanent damage if I continued playing. But I also retired because I had something more important than football waiting for me at home. A 3-year-old son who needed his father more than the world needed another season from an aging quarterback. I glanced down at Gregory, whose face had gone ashen. He was staring at me like he was seeing a ghost, trying to reconcile 35 years of thinking his father was ordinary with the reality being revealed in front of thousands. Someone asked if my son knew about my career. I paused, feeling the weight of the moment. He didn't. I chose not to tell him because I wanted him to respect me for who I was, as his father, not for what I'd accomplished as a young man. I wanted him to learn that a person's worth isn't measured by their fame or their bank account, but by their character and their choices. The stadium was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the players on the sideline had stopped moving, absorbed in this unexpected lesson playing out in their workplace. I chose to be a father instead of a star. No regrets. My voice carried across the stadium with conviction I'd earned through 4 decades of putting family first. I worked construction jobs, painted houses, did whatever it took to provide for my family while keeping my past private, because being Gregory's father was more important than being the public's hero. A voice from the crowd cut through the silence. "Didn't your son know?" "He does now," I replied, looking directly at Gregory. His earlier rage had been replaced by something much more complex: shame, amazement, and the beginning of understanding. Gregory struggled to his feet, his legs unsteady. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible even with the stadium's acoustics. "Dad, forgive me. I didn't know." The crowd could hear the emotion cracking his voice, could see the transformation of a spoiled son realizing he'd been attacking a legend. Some murmured sympathetically. Others watched with the fascination of witnessing a real-time reckoning. "You know now," I said gently but firmly. "The question is what you'll do with that knowledge." I turned back to address the stadium, holding the microphone with the confidence of someone who'd spent years leading teams under pressure. Respect isn't something you can buy with expensive tickets or fancy cars. Respect is earned through consistency, sacrifice, and putting others before yourself. I earned my place in football history, but more importantly, I earned my place as this young man's father by choosing love over glory every single day for 35 years. The applause was thunderous now, not just for my career achievements, but for the lesson and values they'd witnessed. Gregory stood beside me, tears streaming down his face, no longer the arrogant businessman who'd thrown beer in my face, but a son finally seeing his father clearly. "Gregory," I said, turning to him while the crowd listened, "you asked me for $50,000 because you thought I was holding back, keeping wealth from you out of selfishness. The truth is, I gave you everything I had to give: my time, my attention, my guidance, and my love. Those are the only riches that matter." He nodded, unable to speak, his earlier demands for money now seeming absurd in the context of what he'd just learned. The crowd watched our family's healing process with the reverence usually reserved for championship victories. To everyone watching, I continued, addressing the stadium one final time, remember that the person sitting next to you might have a story you never imagined. The quiet neighbor, the modest coworker, the parent you think you understand, they might be carrying achievements and sacrifices you can't see. Respect isn't about what someone can do for you. It's about recognizing the worth in who they are. I handed the microphone back to the sideline crew and sat down. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, waves of appreciation washing over us from every section of the stadium. Gregory sat beside me, no longer the angry son demanding money, but a humbled man beginning to understand his father's true legacy. "Dad," he whispered as the applause continued, "how do I make this right?" "You start by remembering this moment," I replied, putting my hand on his shoulder, "and you never again confuse net worth with self-worth." The game resumed eventually, but neither of us watched much football. We sat together in those expensive seats, father and son rebuilding a relationship on the foundation of truth instead of assumption. Gregory's business might still fail, but he'd learned something more valuable than money: the difference between having a rich father and having a father rich in character. As we walked out of SoFi Stadium together, Gregory stopped and looked back at the field where my secret had been revealed. "I'm proud to be your son," he said quietly. "I should have learned that without needing 70,000 people to teach me." "Now you know," I replied. "That's what matters." The afternoon sun felt warm on our faces as we headed home, both of us changed by the day's events. Respect, I thought, really was something that had to be earned, by both fathers and sons. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.